All right, so we are now recording. Go back to my screen. So on the agenda today, we are, and just to confirm, are you all seeing the welcome screen on your end?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So again, apologies for the miscommunication around the Zoom link. I hope everyone found their way here. I know that puts us behind, but we're going to try to stay on task to keep everyone to respect everyone's time and stay within this 2-hour window and give you all time to ask questions. So the agenda today is we want to talk about the purpose of AmeriCorps funding. We also want to talk about eligibility, the process and timeline, the key highlights from your NOFO and RFGA, any specifics around PHA, and then helpful tips and tricks, along with, of course, that Q&A session at the end. Just wanted to give a brief visual for national service in Washington. As you can see, the latest demographics represent 700 local service sites, a total of 52 AmeriCorps seniors and AmeriCorps members who have served, and our local funding and scholarships earned since 1994. You can also find this information on that website below. This recording will also be available on our website at the conclusion of today's call and the continuation call this afternoon. I'm going to pause for just one moment. AmeriCorps funding. The purpose of AmeriCorps funding, it improves lives, strengthens communities, and fosters civic engagement through service and volunteering. AmeriCorps brings people together to tackle some of the country's most pressing challenges through national service and volunteerism. AmeriCorps members serve with organizations dedicated to the improvement of communities and those serving. AmeriCorps grants are awarded to eligible organizations that engage AmeriCorps members in evidence-based or evidence-informed interventions to strengthen communities. An AmeriCorps member is a person who does community service through AmeriCorps. Members may receive a living allowance and other benefits. After successful completion of their service, members earn a Siegel AmeriCorps Education Award they can use to pay for higher education expenses or apply to qualified student loans. So I want to remind you all that this is for competitive funding, which is annually a fall competition. It is for larger programs, specifically those with 20 plus MSYs. It's to meet national priorities with a single focus area or a well-established multi-effort, and with use of moderate to strong evidence. And if you are interested in formula funding in the future, that information will be coming out in the spring. Historic focus areas, as you can see, are outlined here with disaster services, economic opportunity, so on and so forth. And I'm actually going to go into more specifics around AmeriCorps funding and priority areas. So when we talk about underserved communities, we're talking about serving communities with concentrated poverty, rural communities, tribal communities, and historically underrepresented and underserved individuals. These may include people of color, immigrants, refugees, people with disabilities, LGBTQIA plus individuals, and people with arrest or conviction records, religious minorities, etc. When we talk about the Youth and Mental Health Corps, you'll see those at the bottom because those, the Youth and Mental Health Corps and the Public Health and American Climate Corps are relatively newer strategies that AmeriCorps is focused on. We're talking about implementing programs for or expanding access to high quality youth mental health and substance use recovery services, and preparing AmeriCorps members to enter behavioral health careers. This may include individuals with lived experience with substance use and mental health challenges to support youth mental health efforts and continued AmeriCorps work on the opioid epidemic. You'll also see there's an opportunity for veterans and military families, caregivers, and survivors. This focuses on improving the quality of life for veterans, active duty members of the armed forces, and their families by recruiting veterans, military spouses, and their older children into national service. We also want to talk about promoting environmental stewardship to help communities, especially those that are underserved households and communities, to be more resilient by reducing greenhouse gas emissions, conserving land and water, increasing renewable energy use, and improving at-risk ecosystems. Supporting civic bridge building programs and projects to reduce polarization and community divisions and provide training in civic bridge building skills and techniques to AmeriCorps members. You'll see here the priority funding areas in the state of Washington. So those are obviously specific to strategies driven by the community, organizations that reflect those served. So, you know, if you are wanting to implement an AmeriCorps program in your community, what are the demographics of your community? And what do your AmeriCorps members in your program look like? And do they accurately reflect the community in which you're serving? We're looking for AmeriCorps members with high school credentials. We're interested in career pathway models that show commitment to DEIA, and that engage older adults, tribes, rural, and other underrepresented communities. I wanted to be very transparent with the section that you'll see under B1 in this slide. And this was pulled directly from the NOFO, that AmeriCorps expects a highly competitive AmeriCorps grant competition, and given limited funding, AmeriCorps may prioritize funding existing grantees instead of making new awards. The actual level of funding depends on annual appropriations. So I say that because you're all obviously in a new or recompete era of your AmeriCorps application. And so it's important to be transparent. And while we don't know what the final appropriations coming to the federal level look like right now, it's important to know that there may be increased competition when it comes to funding AmeriCorps applications and at the competitive level. Also want to point out that award amounts will be different depending on the scope of projects. And you'll see that there's AmeriCorps plans to make 3-year grant awards. You'll typically receive an initial award for a 1-year budget. You would be considered a continuation grant if you were to go on beyond year 1 into year 2 and 3. The period of this grant award may not start before July 1st, 2025. So I realize that does probably sound like a long ways away from now, but this is the way the competitive grant cycle occurs at the federal level. And it's important to note that continuation awards are not always guaranteed and will, of course, also depend on future appropriations, satisfactory performance, and we can get into more of those specifics later. So AmeriCorps members engage in direct service a minimum of 70% of the time. You will find a lot of programs don't have a very minimum amount of fundraising, but you can have your members fundraise up to 10% and training up to 20%. Now, there are currently rules that are being worked through their final stages that may increase that training percentage beyond 20%. However, at this time, our understanding is that training is capped at 20%. Training may look like orientation that happens at the front end of your service year. It may look like, team days that you have weekly or bi-weekly or monthly. Anything that's really outside of that scope of direct service is considered training hours. So it's important to maintain accurate timekeeping to make sure you're not going above that 20% or 10% fundraising. AmeriCorps is very strict on not duplicating or displacing employees that are already in the locality of the service being performed. I can provide a specific example from that regarding what that may look like. Coming from a program that I was previously a program director of, we had our members serving in elementary schools. And while their focus, their service area was to provide reading and math interventions for K-5 students, we would have not allowed them to perform paraeducator duties that would displace the school district from hiring that specific paraeducator. But the position really can't supplant paid employees or volunteer positions. So if your partner agency is not going to hire employees or is maybe even going to lay off employees because they have these AmeriCorps members in place, that would be going against the duplication or displacement rules. It's also really important as you start to learn the terminology around AmeriCorps, not to refer to AmeriCorps members as employees. They are most often referred to as AmeriCorps members in the past. You may have heard them referred to as Corps members, but they are participants in a national service position. They are serving. They are not working. They are not employees. And that's really important. So there's no gray area in terms of expectations, benefits, et cetera, that may be happening in their partner agencies. All right, and here's where I'm going to pause and pass it off to Thomas to talk some more specifics about the budget.
Thanks, Diane. So first I'm going to get into the cost reimbursement budgets. For a brand new program, we would typically expect you to go cost reimbursement, which would mean that we would be reimbursing you for actual program costs. And from the application perspective, that would mean that you have an itemized budget that has fairly specific costs in general categories. So for this, there's so you have a budget narrative. There's gonna be calculations that you're gonna need to demonstrate to show that the totals that you're listing for each line item, make sure that those are accurate. Like, you don't have to know, down to the mile exactly how far you're gonna travel, but what you project you're going to travel, you're going to want to be down to the dollar on how much that's going to cost, right? Your calculation needs to make sense. Make sure that things are in the right categories. A common one is when you travel for a training, the travel costs will go under travel, but registration fees will go under the training category. Also, consider that when you do salary and fringe benefits, those are two separate categories, but they need to be itemized. So don't lump sum everybody's salary. Make sure that you clearly define the role of each person that's going to be on the grant. Do that in both the salary and fringe benefits categories. And generally, don't be too vague about the categories that you're doing. Like, if you want to say office supplies and give a couple examples of what office supplies would be, that's fine. If you're just like, general supplies, that's probably a little too vague. It would be the same with travel. Don't just say travel around the state. That's not, that's not specific enough. But you don't have to say, travel to this address in this town. Just travel to sites. Average travel distance of 50 miles, something like that. We'll probably go to the next slide. Yes, and then we have to get into the indirect. So if you're familiar with an indirect rate, if your organization has a federally approved indirect rate, that's what we're going to expect you to use. So for example, like school districts often have an indirect rate. Any organization that uses federal grants might have an indirect rate, so check with your fiscal people whether you do or not. Anything that you change in your direct costs, which is the first two sections of the grant of the application, budget narrative application, it's going to affect the percentage that's applied. So, 5% of 200,000 is different than 5% of 220,000. So when you adjust your direct costs, you're going to have to adjust your indirect costs. So the de minimis indirect rate has been increased from 10% to 15%. So if you use the de minimis, you're eligible to use 15%. The de minimis has some limitations in application. There are some categories of costs that you can't apply the de minimis toward. Overall, if you don't have an indirect rate, I would recommend that you continue to use the corporation's fixed 5%, 10% option, which is 5% of direct federal costs that you're proposing and 10% of all direct costs. And that would be on the match side. So if there's any questions about indirect, I can speak to it a little more, but it's going to be a little bit of a complicated concept if you aren't familiar with it. So moving on, there's another portion, the source of funds. This gets skipped a lot, but it's very important. When you have a grantee share, you have to propose a certain level of grantee share, and the source of funds is demonstrating where those funds are coming from. It needs to match your grantee share. So, and it needs to be specific. Like, don't just say host site fees and then just throw a lump sum out there. At least say 30 host site fees at $10,000 each or something like that. And the more specific you can be, the better. And there's certain costs that will need to go in the budget narrative. Fingerprinting, background checks are one for sure. That'll go in other operating costs. There's also travel to our meetings in Olympia and also our regional meetings, and a few others that'll be in the instructions. We can go to the next slide. Now, for fixed amount grants, I think most of the recompetes here are going for fixed. So just real quick for everybody else, fixed amount, you're reimbursed based on member hours served. So it relies on good enrollment and retention numbers, and you don't have a budget to guide you. You have to understand all the financial implications of a AmeriCorps program. But it's pretty much the same. There is talk that we're getting a new system that's going to change the way we do budgets, but that's not going to happen for this cycle. So you'll want to pay close attention to the instructions on page 33. Make sure that when you list member slots, you list members without living allowance, even though you're paying them a living allowance. When you show your MSY calculations, be transparent and as with cost reimbursement, make sure that you are transparent and complete with your source of funds. And in the instructions, there's a checklist on page 35 that all budget types can use. And I think that might be it for me.
All right, thanks,
Any
Thomas.
questions?
Yeah, I want to take a moment to pause with any questions there may be so far. And then again, as a reminder, we'll also definitely hold time for questions at the end. I'll give it just a few more seconds in case anyone's typing a question in the chat.
Excuse me, do you want the questions in the chat for records, or do you want us to verbally ask them?
You can go ahead and verbally ask them. We're recording this.
Great. Well, I missed most of the webinar because of a accountant calling me. So are we going to, or have we already covered, assuming a person is successful in their application, what is the process for aligning the volunteer with the organization's needs?
Gotcha. So I think we are going to cover more of the timeline and the process here.
Later? Okay.
Yeah, I'm hoping we'll answer your question, George. If we don't, then we'll happily address it at the end as well.
Okay, thank you.
Uh-huh. Any other questions at the moment? While the budgets may be fresh on everyone's mind.
There is a question in the chat.
Thank you. On the slide about estimated funds available, is your understanding that they're including recompetes as new grantees? That's my understanding. Micaiah and Thomas, do you have anything to add to that?
I'm trying to see if Thomas was able to come off mute. I'll just say that it is my understanding that they are considering them in that same pool, but Thomas may have different information from the symposium recently.
No, I think that's generally the way they look at it.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Yeah, great question. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and continue on with the slides, and then again, we'll take some more time to pause as needed.
Before we move on, Diane, I see another question in the chat that I don't believe has been addressed
Oh, you're right. Thank you, Mary.
from Kelly.
Yes,
Mhm.
thank you. I have a lot of screens open, so I appreciate that. All right, so Kelly asked, how do we know if we qualify as a larger program? What does MSY mean? If we are looking to apply to host 1 to 2 AmeriCorps members, would we be better suited to wait and apply in the spring? So MSY means member service year. So typically if you have full-time members and they're serving a full, 1700 hour slot, that would take 1 MSY. However, there will be times where an MSY is split up between individuals. So you may have 2 part-time members that fill 1 MSY because AmeriCorps is hours based. If you're looking to apply to host 1 to 2 AmeriCorps members, Micaiah, do you mind answering that question? I'm assuming the spring formula would be a better opportunity as well, since competitive is looking for 20 plus members, correct?
Between yes, 20 plus members. And for formula as well, we tend to try to keep it at a minimum of at least 10. There are waivers available, obviously, to go fewer than 10. I'm not sure if we would go as few as 1 to 2. That may be a different AmeriCorps option, perhaps Vista or something like that. But that certainly could be a separate conversation with that program so that we could kind of go more in depth with what they're thinking.
Thank you. So Kelly, if
Yeah,
you,
and
oh,
I
sorry,
would
go
just
ahead,
add,
Thomas.
sorry, that if what you're looking for is just 1 to 2 members, something small like that, it's probably not going to scale very well with a grant like this. So you might want to look into Washington Service Corps, who works with organizations that want smaller numbers of members and offers, opportunities to have a few AmeriCorps members like that.
Thank you, Thomas. Great minds think alike. So Kelly, if you want to connect with me after this, I can definitely point you in the right direction and give you that contact information to possibly speak with a program officer here or someone with Washington Service Corps. Great question. All right, so moving on to eligible applicants. Again, back to that MSY, and I know from having filled out previous AmeriCorps funding applications that the MSY portion can be confusing. And so we're happy to explain that again as needed. But again, typically, if you were to have a program and the design is for 20 AmeriCorps members and you plan for all 20 to be full-time, then you would have 20 MSYs and then do the math accordingly from there. If you wanted 40, half-time members, that would still compute into the 20 MSYs. Just another reminder that the program start date cannot be earlier than August 1st of 2025 and later than January 1st, 2026, which sounds like a long time away again, but it'll be here before you know it, especially in the AmeriCorps world. And then I'm sure many of you are on the call are from a nonprofit background. Eligible entities are nonprofits, institutions of higher ed, state and local governments, tribal governments. Just, a note that if you're a federally recognized tribe, you would apply to AmeriCorps, the federal agency. A non-federal tribe would apply directly to us. And additionally, you would need to have a UEI number, an EIN number, and a SAM registration. Sometimes there's some confusion around that SAM registration piece. So if you run into that, we're happy to help you out with that. But most organizations already have at least the UEI and the EIN. So the RFGA process, this kind of breaks it down and hopefully simplifies it a little bit for you all. Again, I have quite literally been in your shoes. I was with a previous formula grant, not competitive. However, the acronyms were very foreign to me to begin with. I didn't understand, the process of application. So I'm happy to walk through all of this with you. So in the process, right now you're in the TTA process, so you have not submitted your grant in eGrants. To the best of my knowledge, nobody has. And then the Serve Washington Commission reviews them and votes. That's a commission of, it would be approximately 3 commissioners that would review those applications and vote. Serve Washington staff would then take the opportunity to reach out to applicants who were selected for what's called a clarification period. So what may happen during that time is we may see an error in the budget that you've built. The numbers aren't aligning. You may have selected, the wrong application, put information in the wrong piece. I want to be clear and say that we're not going to reach out to you and say, your application doesn't look great. Here's what we recommend you write instead, because we're really limited in our scope of help we can really assist with during that time. However, I feel very strongly, and I know we all do, that we do want to set you up for success. So we will utilize that clarification period as much as we can to our capabilities. Once that period's over, your applications would be submitted to AmeriCorps on behalf of Serve Washington. AmeriCorps, the federal agency, would review, and then they would therefore have the opportunity, if there's clarification, they may reach back out to us to clarify with you all about some specifics in your application. When the awards are made, that's when the fun starts and you get your program and AmeriCorps members to help your organization. This is something that you all have seen by this point because you're all on this call. So the grant applications, while they went out in email to some programs a couple of days before, they were posted on our website on September 3rd. So that's what we're going with our official grant application release. You all are clearly on the call that we're having right now. The due date is coming up October 3rd by 5 p.m. that day, and that is a very strict due date and time to adhere to. So make sure you set your alarms, your calendar reminders, whatever you need to do. And then you'll see the dates for, staff review, the grant review committee, and then the clarification period that would happen. Not every applicant will need to have some revisions, but just be aware that date would start around November 8th. And then the final vote from the commissioners on the 5th. And then you would be notified from Serve Washington staff, most likely myself, about the vote on moving forward with your application. Again, there's that clarification revision period. I see that more as, making some minor corrections before the applications are submitted to AmeriCorps. And we set a hard date for ourselves of January 9th. And then the AmeriCorps would be notifying not until mid-April. So again, the timeline may seem wonky, but we are subject to adhering to the federal agency's guidelines. Again, there's another clarification period that would happen in the spring, and then the awards would be potentially issued next summer around the July timeframe. So again, realizing that there's a lot of acronyms in AmeriCorps. And sometimes it takes a long time to really understand. And I think the acronyms are thrown around very freely. So hopefully these terms help. The NOFO is the application that was released by AmeriCorps, the federal agency, for national directs and state commission applications. So that is what this call is for, the state commission application. The RFGA is what myself, released on behalf of Serve Washington to really be that guiding force on how you want to complete your application and the specific timelines you need to adhere to. There was a question about competitive versus formula. Right now we're in the national competition. We are in the fall, believe it or not. And then the state competition will be held this spring. So definitely keep an eye on our website. Reach out to any of us here on the Serve Washington staff if you're interested in possibly participating in that spring formula competition. Thomas can always give a lot more information about cost reimbursement versus fixed amount, but these are the very brief descriptions. The budget, a match required, whereas fixed, it's very flat rate based, and to be honest, the monthly reporting is not nearly as cumbersome as cost reimbursement. However, sometimes it just aligns better with the organization capacity to be cost reimbursement. I personally came from a cost reimbursement program, so I'm familiar with that. And then, a lot of times there's questions on, am I new? Am I recompete? Am I continuation? Which column am I on? Which application am I filling out? We want to be sure that we're being as transparent as possible about which application you should be filling out. So right now, all of you are obviously either a new potential applicant or a recompete. And recompete, again, means that you have already been a recipient of AmeriCorps funding, which was on a 3-year cycle, and you're having to start that 3-year cycle over, and you're interested in applying for a new opportunity. Most of the time, recompetes have the same program design and same implications in mind, but there is that opportunity when you become a recompete. If you want to switch up your program design or switch up your focus areas, that's a good time to do so, as it's not really possible as much during the continuation cycle. Continuation, again, if you were to be funded this year, next year at this time, you would be entering year 2, the following year, year 3. And if things are going well, which we hope they would all for you, you would be back as a recompete. So there's a lot of differences between the NOFO and the RFGA, and there's a lot of similarities. So it's really important that you're following the dates in that RFGA. So that timeline that I just showed, I believe 2 slides ago, it's very important that you follow those dates, as we're the ones who are really the filter for your application into the federal agency. So you may see some dates in the NOFO. A good way to kind of digest the difference between the NOFO and the RFGA is the RFGA is really meant to be a simplified version of the NOFO. It's meant to pare down the information, make it a little bit more easy to digest. So always refer to those dates in the RFGA. If you ever have any questions about dates, timelines, we are available for those questions. You will see some information in your NOFO about required additional documents, which I believe Lou will be covering later in this presentation. And it's very important that you do not submit those directly to AmeriCorps, that you instead follow the RFGA. And we have this email address that you will be seeing a lot over and over. And it's really important that you also email any questions regarding your applications or the application process specifically to that servewashington@ofm.wa.gov email address. This will be monitored regularly during the application process, and we will reply accordingly. I want to talk about some NOFO items that do apply to the Serve Washington applicants. The page limits have changed for those of you that are a recompete. There's now 11, but I will definitely emphasize the importance of adhering to the page limits. The logic model is 8, the application is 11. Some of the narratives have changed. And then the one important change that's happened over the past few months is the match change. So again, this may be familiar terminology to recompetes. In the past, programs that were in their 10th or more year of AmeriCorps funding were required to match at a 50% rate. And that became quite cumbersome for a lot of programs to keep up with that. As AmeriCorps is increasing funding and trying to keep up with cost of living and all of that, agencies are also expected to adhere to that as well. And 50% was not necessarily setting up a foundation for keeping things equitable in the AmeriCorps community. So we appreciate the fact that the federal agency has released and lowered that maximum matching percentage at 30%. So that's actually great news. The maximum cost per MSY has not changed. For those of you that are recompete, it's at $25,000. However, there has been an increase in the full-time living allowance with a minimum of $20,400 and a max of $40,800. You can see there's obviously a huge range in there. So as you're building out your budget, you will have to see what aligns with the budget and the potential funding. And if you have specific questions around that, Thomas can answer those as we're getting towards the end of this presentation. Criminal history checks. If you become a partner with us in AmeriCorps, or for those of you that already are, you're never going to not hear about criminal history checks. That is probably one of, if not the biggest compliance protocol and issue with our AmeriCorps program. 100% compliance is needed at all times. Not being compliant in that area can definitely result in loss of funding and having to potentially pay back those funds. So we want to always be proactive about that and get ahead of it and make sure that that doesn't happen. And your program officers, if you are awarded an AmeriCorps grant, your program officers can definitely walk you through that. We provide training through Serve Washington as well. We are transitioning. We used to have, well, we still do, for another couple of months, 2 criminal history check vendors. One was for fingerprints, one was for NSOPW, which is the National State. I'm probably going to mess up this acronym because I'm so used to using it. If anyone wants to correct me in the chat, but the criminal history checks had to be conducted with both vendors, and luckily we're now transitioning to one vendor, which is TrueScreen, that will complete both the fingerprint side of the background check as well as the other side. I did look into it. It doesn't sound like that cost is going to change. So as you're building your budget, you want to make sure to include that $68 per staff and per potential AmeriCorps member that you would need to complete their criminal history checks. And it's always advisable to add some extra wiggle room, because if you have members that depart service early and you bring on another member, you would also have to provide a criminal history check for them. If you're a program that is going to provide supervisory match, you would also want to make sure that your supervisors and any staff members charging time to your AmeriCorps grant also complete criminal history checks. And I realize this is very high level information, especially if you're applying for new funding. So happy to answer those questions again towards the end, or you can always send future questions throughout this process to that email address. It's important to also learn about prohibited and unallowable activities. Some of these include lobbying, voting, polling. That cannot happen while an AmeriCorps member is serving. There's also other activities regarding providing abortion services and referrals, and those would all be defined in your terms and conditions, and we can give more specific examples for that as questions pop up as well. All right, so program design. So a lot of people wonder how the weight is spread out through your application. It's important to remember that not all sub-criteria are of equal value, but here's a visual where you can see your program design obviously is the kind of the key holder and the percentage of how your application may potentially be graded. Whereas there's some other pieces in here that are obviously important as well. So it's nice to have a visual to see when those who are reviewing your application, when they're scoring you and deciding on your funding and or level of funding, what they're really kind of focused on. All right, and I think I'm going to pause here and actually give everyone an opportunity to take a breath, ask questions as you need, take yourself off mute, put a question in the chat, and then I will pass it off to Lou.
Hey, this is George Rowe. If I could ask a question.
Sure.
Yeah, do you guys broker any kind of like matchmaking between possible applicants so that people can share their strengths and reduce redundancies?
Thomas, do you want to take this question? I'm not sure that I quite understand it.
So to clarify, are you saying between programs or?
Yeah,
Like,
so
okay.
in the past, when I've made, grant applications for this or that, they'll have, in some cases, what they call like an industry day, or provide a web service where people can self-nominate or self-declare, like, I'm blah, blah, blah organization. These are my strengths. We're looking for a partner to compete in this way or that way. Anybody interested? Here's our contact data, something like that.
Well, the short answer, I would say probably no.
Okay.
I'm trying to think of where we might touch on that concept, but yeah, I mean, you probably saw the biggest example of it earlier in the call when you know, a potential program asked, you know, what we would do for someone who wanted like 1 or 2 members.
Right.
And we suggested Service Corps. They have a wide range of available options for, so, you know, so we know that Service Corps is somebody who can take on a lot of potential organizations with a lot of potential, you know, goals in mind. But other than that, I don't know. I don't know that we have a lot of. I don't know that there's a lot of competition so much that you're trying to get a little piece of territory that's yours,
Right.
you know, and pushing back and forth with other programs. So, again, short answer, probably no.
Okay, got it. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Right, like I would add not formally, but maybe we do that a little informally. And I think it's a great idea. But
If
yeah,
you want
it's
to
something,
dialogue it, just I'll put my contact data in the thing. It was so helpful. And part of it is just getting to know the community when you're, you know, maybe you don't know them. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, if there's no other questions, I think we're ready for Lou.
All right, thanks, Diane. So I want to take a moment to highlight a broader topic, which is AmeriCorps' definition of theory of change, which has 3 basic elements, which is the problem or need statement, the evidence-based intervention, and the intended outcome. An aligned theory of change has an assumed cause and effect relationship. And the boxes shown on the screen with the community problem, the intervention, outcome, evidence, some of these are now in various sections of the application. It's not just one piece, but I wanted to talk about it as a greater whole. But the different aspects might be described in different places of the application, but I just want to make it clear that these things are all connected. So we can go to the next slide. So first, the community problem. This is captured in the narrative section. The problem is the negative condition that exists in the service area proposed. And you're going to be talking about what is the scope, what's the significance, and the cause of that problem. That statement will answer questions such as who's affected, how many, how severe is this? And it also should answer the question, so what? What will likely happen if nothing is done? And finally, why does this problem even exist? How is it perpetuated? That problem statement should reflect statistics and data sources that are as reputable, current, and local to your service area as you can find. Applicants are also asked to provide a detailed summary regarding how the inequities faced by the underserved community may be contributing to the problem. And a word of caution here about very lengthy problem statements that outline every possible negative condition in your service area, even if they're irrelevant to the proposed intervention and outcome. So we do want to make sure that whatever you're describing is specific to your program and what you're going to be addressing. Next slide. Now this part is a little bit newer, so some of you may not have had to do this in an application before, but In the application narrative, applicants are asked to discuss the community need as it relates to the CDC's Social Vulnerability Index. And you should be able, I believe the link is provided in the NOFO. And when you go in there, you are able to zoom in further and really drill down even to like census block data. And I do want to mention that we have seen applicants forget to include this, and AmeriCorps took note, and it did have a negative impact. So I really want to highlight this social vulnerability index and make sure that you're looking into it and you're including it as one of your data sources. It's not going to be the only data source that you're relying on to describe your community need, but it should be part of that section. Next slide. Now let's talk a little bit about the intervention. That is the set of activities that will produce the intended outcome. And it's really important to clearly define each aspect of the intervention. Don't assume that the reader understands your intention, especially if you're using an intervention that maybe is really common, like tutoring or mentoring. We want to know what's the exact design and the dosage. So we're looking for what's the frequency, what's the intensity, and the duration of your intervention. Those should all be well defined. So who does what with whom, how often, how many times, for what proposed length of time. The narrative should describe how your intervention will lead to the outcomes identified in your logic model. And a word of caution about interventions that are defined in really general terms, but don't have that level of detail or support of evidence. And then finally, the intended outcome is simply the change or the changes that you hope to see. And a word of caution here about outcomes that are really difficult to measure or maybe don't quite align with your proposed intervention and the need that you're describing. Let's talk a little bit about the logic model. Next slide. Thank you. The logic model should capture your program's theory of change, with the exception of the evidence piece. The evidence we'll talk about in a moment, and that is part of the narrative. But otherwise, your logic model has been expanded to allow for a maximum of 8 pages. Even though you have lots of room, they are really narrow columns, so we still recommend using bullet points or short phrases rather than full sentences. When read from left to right, the logic model answers the question, if, then. So if we have 20 AmeriCorps members, then 400 students will receive services, and on throughout the chart. You could also read it backwards, and then it would answer the question, but how? So if 400 students need services, that would require 20 AmeriCorps members serving. The logic model encompasses short, medium, and long-term outcomes, and this may represent time or conditional change for the longer-term outcomes, but really think ABCs like attitude, behavior, and condition. It's important to note that not all of the outcomes require an associated performance measure, and we will talk more about performance measures in a bit. But again, the logic model is really capturing your full theory of change, all of your program activities, everything that you're proposing your members to do, and the changes you're hoping to make in your community. You don't necessarily have to report on every single one that you're describing in your logic model. You will likely choose to only measure one of the outputs and one aligned short-term outcome. Those longer-term outcomes are more relevant for something like evaluation later on, or may simply represent an ultimate change in condition that you're hoping that your program can reach. So choose whatever makes the most sense for your program. It really depends on the program design, but just know that you're not required to develop performance measures for all of the outputs and outcomes that you include in your logic model. The logic model really should read like a story of your program, a blueprint from point A to point B, and there should be really clear alignment from one column to the next. A reader should be able to envision what a day in the life of your program looks like. Next slide. The level of evidence in support of the intervention increases the likelihood of cause and effect relationship in your theory of change. The NOFO and supplemental guidance outline a spectrum of evidence. We encourage the use of evidence-based and evidence-informed interventions. And we know that not all program designs will fall into the moderate or strong evidence as defined by the NOFO. That's completely okay. AmeriCorps acknowledges currently funded applications fall all across the spectrum, and actually more programs are in the preliminary stages of evidence. The hope is that over time, the AmeriCorps portfolio will shift as funded programs gain traction in the area of evaluation and build upon their program's evidence. Next slide. So just a little bit more on evidence. Again, please reference the NOFO and supplemental guidance. There's detail in there that's really helpful. So in the narrative section, applicants should fully summarize any study designs and key findings of any evaluations. Second, they should describe any other evidence that supports the proposed program design, such as past performance data or other research findings that should be described all directly in the narrative. And if you submit evaluation reports for consideration, those should be described in this evidence section. And you need to talk about how the intervention described in the study matches yours. So a little more about that narrative. Sorry, yeah, right slide. Thank you. So this section is scored on two parts: the level of evidence, or the tier as AmeriCorps calls it, but also on the quality of evidence. So the level of evidence or tier defined in the supplemental guidance include pre-preliminary, preliminary, moderate, and strong. The only tiers that allow for additional submissions of hard copy evaluations beyond the narrative description are preliminary, moderate, and strong evidence. So if you are falling into the pre-preliminary category, you only need to describe evaluations, research, or data just within that narrative section. And eligible applicants should only submit evaluation reports that reflect the exact same intervention and program design, and only up to 2 reports. However, if you are recompeting and required to submit an evaluation based on your evaluation requirements, separate from the evidence requirements, you should still submit that evaluation report also. So it's possible some programs may end up submitting up to 3 reports total. If you're not sure if this is you, we can talk and make sure that you're clear. So this is addressed in the NOFO evidence sections. So do read those parts very carefully. Next slide. I have a few points to share here on the performance measures and the performance measure module. So all applicants must include at least one aligned performance measure. So that would be an output and a corresponding outcome. And that would be related to your proposed primary intervention. This may be a national performance measure. So AmeriCorps has national performance measures kind of pre-written that you can select if it matches what you are proposing to do. However, if none of those national performance measures accurately captures your intervention, you can create an applicant-determined measure. Any performance measures reflecting activities that are not central to your program model shouldn't be included in your application, and they don't need to be reported to AmeriCorps. You might still want to include it in your application you might still want to collect the data just for your own program purposes. It's totally fine, but you don't need to include that in your application. So just using our logic model example on the screen now is what a program might choose for their performance measure. The output would be 400 students served, and of those 400 students, 275 will improve math scores by 10% or greater. Next slide. A common pitfall we see in the performance measure module are really lengthy problem statements, as well as long paragraphs under the described instrument section. So just note that the problem statement can be a very brief summary. Even 1, 2, 3 sentences is completely adequate. Next slide. Likewise, the described instrument section, keep it as brief as possible, but there are quite a few pieces of information that we want to see there. So it may be a little bit longer, and that's fine. For your outcome performance measure described instrument statement, you do need to be sure to specify who's counted. For example, only those who complete the full dosage. You'll want to explain the change required between pre and post to be counted and indicate how this change is significant or meaningful. So we have an example, if that's helpful. Next slide. So let's look at the documents that will accompany your application. I mentioned a few, and we'll kind of recap, but there are a few others. All applicants will submit an operational and financial management survey and the organization's most recently audited financials. This could be a single audit if your organization is subject to federal single audit requirements, or simply the organization's audited financial statement from a third-party auditor. Any applicable evidence documents that we talked about just a moment ago, those evaluation reports would be included as an additional document. If you are recompeting for the first time, you would also be submitting an evaluation plan. And if you are recompeting for a second or third or fourth or fifth time, you would be submitting your evaluation report from the previous 3 years, as well as a new evaluation plan for the upcoming 3 years. And I do want to note that AmeriCorps has gotten more specific about the evaluation report should be a Word document. They're really going to be looking for that. So I'll also be checking that as they come in. But they're wanting evaluation reports and plans to be in Word. Lastly, if applicable, submit a labor union concurrence and or tribal eligibility. Okay, a little bit more about the evaluation plan. Next slide. It is now a template that's available with all the other application materials, so definitely use that template and fill it out as completely as you can. You would enter in eGrants. There's a field in eGrants for evaluation plan that's just kind of left over from the past. So if you see that, just enter in A, and then if you are required to submit an evaluation plan, so remember, only if you're recompeting for a second or more cycle, then you would submit the evaluation plan with using the new template. The plans are not scored as part of the grant making process. If awarded, these evaluation plans will be reviewed and approved by AmeriCorps, the agency. It is in your best interest to fully answer each criteria in the template. Don't skip sections and be as detailed as possible. If awarded and the plan is not approved, there will be an opportunity to revise your plan and resubmit it. But the more work you can do now, the more you can save yourself hassle later. So if you end up having any questions on the evaluation plan template or what your evaluation requirements are, please reach out to me. I'm happy to talk through that. And now I will pass it back to Diane or answer any questions if anything has come up.
Thank you, Lou. I'll pause and give everyone some time to reflect before I move on to this next slide.
I do see one question in the chat from a bit ago, but I'm not sure if we answered that one. Do we want to?
Oh, sure. George, let's see, is there any way that grant recipients can influence some elective course subset of the training that is offered by AmeriCorps, for example, climate change effects background, language acquisition, nonverbal communication? George, I'm not fully sure I understand your question. Do you mind expanding upon that?
Absolutely, thank you. So my understanding, based on a quick review online of the AmeriCorps evaluation thing for last year, was that AmeriCorps offers some kind of core training for the members. Is that correct?
So each program would have its own training curriculum. Lou, are you familiar with anything in the evaluation piece that he's referring to?
I'm not sure. I'm very curious what they offered. I don't know if it was like something specific to climate programs.
Yeah, this may be one of those questions, George, where we need to look into it and get back to you if that's okay, unless
That's
anyone
great.
else. Okay,
That's great.
thank you. Thanks for your patience with that. All right, I'm going to go ahead and move on with eGrants tips. So, to put it bluntly, eGrants is quite an antiquated platform for AmeriCorps applications. Therefore, AmeriCorps is actually transitioning to a new platform as far as submitting applications. However, that will not impact your current application. So I'm not really going to spend any time into the potentials of the new platform just yet, because there's a lot of information we're still waiting to hear on that. But just kind of an FYI that next year and beyond, that you would no longer be submitting your applications through eGrants as we know it today. But some important tips are that it's always really helpful if you're creating your application pieces outside of eGrants. We've heard stories of eGrants, crashing or pausing or not saving work. I never really had any terrible horror stories, but I know they exist out there. eGrants also likes to keep things very simplistic, no fancy formatting, keep things, thanks, George, keep things very simple. And you can use all caps for your section headings, which is actually really helpful for the requirements of keeping your formatting really simple. Having those all caps really helps delineate between each of your sections. When printing, be very careful that you are adhering to those page limits as far as the 11 pages and then the 8 as Lou described, because eGrants will automatically double space. It's not always perfect between Word and eGrants, so definitely test, print things out. I know myself, I had times where I was positive that I was within the page limits, and then once I printed out, I had to check and go back and alter several times, because what I was seeing on my end is not always what eGrants is seeing. Save as much as often as you're going through your screens in your grant application. You'll always, or you should always, see a save option, I believe, at both the top and the bottom of your screen. And so be sure to always utilize that save option. It is your friend. And we also recommend that you use Chrome. Some more application tips. Again, read the NOFO, read it section by section, whatever works for you. There's a lot of fine details in there that are not to be skipped. Source your sites in your narrative, but please don't add links. Your information should match in all sections. So this is probably an easy mistake to make. A lot of times we might get fixated on the budget and update in one area, and then it will offset your whole budget and you'll have to go back through. And then same with the demographics and the data. So if you start building your application and you think that you're going to apply for 17 AmeriCorps MSY, and then as contemplating and working through your application, you decide to just round it down to 15. Make sure you're updating it in every area, specifically in your performance measures and budget and all of that. All sections of your eGrants application have to be in sync, and they all have to be in agreement with each other. You will want to validate your budget before submission. It usually will pop up errors, but not all the time. So that's when we would be able to hopefully utilize that clarification period. Make sure you have the correct personnel as your authorized rep, not your program director. If you are a program director, you should have a separate person who is your authorized rep. So you may be the person that builds your entire application, does every detail, and then you may not be the authorized signing authority. So make sure those correct people are listed on there and notify us right away if any of those names are incorrect. Another reminder about the project date, that it's 1 full year, which may not always reflect the member service year. Member service years can vary. Always print a final application of your review. And like we do here at Serve Washington, give yourself an early deadline, because you don't want to be submitting applications at 4:59 on October 3rd and find that you don't have internet access or something shut down or eGrants is not cooperating. So you work with your own schedule and your own work style to make sure that you are adhering to give yourself some buffer room in there. And then we always recommend a second set of eyes. Sometimes I know I can look through and read things over and over again and it looks perfect to me. And then I hand it over to someone else and within 10 seconds they spot an error. So just best practices to have someone who's maybe not invested in your program, who can just be an impartial reviewer. We don't have any recompete applicants, or I'm sorry, we do have recompete applicants on here. So just remember that increase to living allowance, pay special attention to the NOFO instructions for narratives. I think that there may be a tendency sometimes to kind of skip over the narratives if you know your program design may not be changing. Make sure you're going through all of that with a fine-tooth comb and updating, answering those specific questions as outlined in the NOFO with precision. And making sure that you're paying attention to the performance measures if they change, and then just reading all the current definitions and verifying all the report requirements, and don't ever assume that any part of the application will be the same as it was 3 years ago. All right, now we are ready for our AmeriCorps Q&A, and I want to remind you all that we will have the RFGA posted on the website. Here's another reminder of that email address, and then we will have our readiness assessment linked as well. But I would like to pause and give anyone the opportunity to ask any questions as needed. You may post those in the chat or feel free to come off mute and ask us. I want to give everyone a fair amount of time, so I'll give it at least 2 minutes for people to think of or type questions. as we're kind of winding this down, I'm not seeing or hearing any questions just yet. Just want to remind you to please, again, submit questions to that specific email address. And I want to thank you all again for your interest and thank you for your patience. And I apologize again about possibly having that wrong Zoom link in here. So thank you for navigating through that with us. And I'll give it just another second, but so far I don't see anything else. Do any of my colleagues have anything to add that I may have missed? All right, well, I'm not seeing anything, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. It looks like we'll be finishing a little bit early, but again, please reach out. We want to make sure that you're successful and we have the reach to the community that you're all envisioning. So thank you for your time today. Bye, everyone.
Diane and Micaiah, should we assume that the link for the afternoon is also wrong on the website and go with the one that was in the invitation?
Yes, I will see if Denise or someone can update that really quickly on the website. If anyone has any other suggestions, I'm open to that.
I think Rachel works on the website too. I don't know what her availability is today, but maybe write to both of them and see who can get to it first.
Yeah,
Just
we can do
a
that.
heads up, we're still on recording, by the way.